It is the 26th of June, 1953. Moscow breathes in its summer stillness, that particular quiet the city keeps before the heat arrives, before the streets fill, before the machinery of the day grinds back to life. On Malaya Nikitskaya Street, behind iron gates and tall stone walls, the mansion sits in the kind of hush that only power can purchase. 3 stories of pre-revolutionary architecture, reborn as a fortress. The curtains are drawn. The guards at the perimeter have kept their post through the night, as they always do, as they have done for 15 years. And then, boots on the steps. A fist against the door. Military uniforms. Not the familiar faces of the household security detail, but strangers. Men whose eyes do not apologize. Nina Gagich-Kori Beria, 51 years old, opens the door herself. She looks at the men. She does not scream. She does not tremble. There are accounts, fragmented, whispered, preserved only in the memories of those who stood in that hallway, that she simply asked one question, in a voice so quiet it barely registered, above the morning silence. Is he alive? No one answered her. What followed was the end of a world that had taken 3 decades to build, a world assembled from ambition and intelligence and the particular ruthlessness that the Soviet 20th century demanded of anyone who wished not merely to survive, but to ascend. But to understand what collapsed on that June morning, you must go back. You must go back to the red clay hills of western Georgia, to a village most maps do not bother to name, to a boy born in the final year of a dying century who would one day hold the fate of millions in his hands. And you must also go back to a woman, because this story, despite everything history has chosen to emphasize, was always at its most essential about 2 people who chose each other. The village of Merhuli sits in the Abkhazian lowlands, a settlement so modest that its existence registered on no ledger of consequence. In 1899, in a house with a packed earth floor, Lavrenti Pavlovich Beria was born to a Mingrelian peasant family. His father, Pavel, was a man who worked the land and asked little of fate. His mother, Martha, was something different entirely, a woman of iron will and ferocious religious devotion, who, according to those who knew her, believed, with the certainty of someone who has spoken directly to God, that her son was destined for greatness. She was not wrong. She was also perhaps not entirely right in what she imagined that greatness would mean. The western Georgian countryside in the final years of the Russian Empire was not a place that invited softness. It was a landscape of terraced hillsides and subtropical forests and rivers that ran cold and fast from the mountains to the sea. It was also a place of ancient resentments, of local pride ground beneath the weight of imperial administration, of poverty that was structural rather than incidental, of a population that had learned over centuries that survival required a particular combination of outward accommodation and inward defiance. You showed the authorities what they needed to see. You kept your true self carefully concealed. Lavrenti absorbed this lesson early and absorbed it completely. He was, by all accounts, an exceptional student, methodical, retentive, capable of mastering technical material with an efficiency that startled his teachers. He left Merhuli to study construction engineering in Sukhumi, then moved to Baku to continue his education. He was slight, wore thick spectacles that gave him an air of studious detachment, and spoke in measured, deliberate sentences. He did not waste words. He did not waste anything. What he possessed, and what no examination could measure, was an absolute clarity of purpose. He understood, with the instinctive intelligence of someone born with nothing, that the revolution sweeping through the former empire was not primarily an ideological event. It was a vacancy, an enormous, unprecedented vacancy at every level of power, and into that vacancy a man of sufficient nerve and sufficient intelligence could insert himself and rise without limit. He joined the Bolshevik cause, not out of burning conviction, but out of strategic recognition. The Cheka, the secret police apparatus that Felix Dzerzhinsky was building into the Soviet state's most essential instrument, needed educated men who could think clearly, follow orders absolutely, and feel no particular distress at what those orders required. Beria was 20 years old when he began his career in intelligence. He was 30 when he became head of the Georgian GPU. He was not yet 40 when Stalin summoned him to Moscow. But before any of that, before all of that, there was Nino. Her full name was Nina Teymurazovna Gegechkori, and she arrived in Lavrenti Beria's life sometime in the early 1920s like a correction, like the universe inserting something into his path that he had not calculated for and could not entirely control. She came from a different world, not a wealthy world, not an aristocratic one, but a cultivated one, the kind of Georgian intelligentsia household where French and Russian were spoken alongside the native language, where books were treated as necessities rather than luxuries, where a woman's education was considered as important as a man's. Her father was an agronomist. Her mother was a woman of considerable personal culture. Nina grew up speaking 4 languages fluently, playing piano with genuine skill, reading European literature in its original tongues. She was studying chemistry in Tiflis, the city that would be renamed Tbilisi, when she met him. The exact circumstances of their meeting have been described in several different ways by several different sources, none of whom agree on the precise details and all of whom agree on the essential fact that the attraction was immediate, mutual, and serious. What Nina Gegechkori saw in Lavrenti Beria in the early 1920s requires some act of historical imagination. He was not charming in the conventional sense. He was not handsome. He was not warm. But he was, and every account from that period confirms this, extraordinarily present. When he focused his attention on you, you felt it as something almost physical. And he had focused his attention on her with an intensity that even she, a woman of considerable intelligence and self-possession, found difficult to resist. She was not naive. This point matters enormously, and the historical record insists upon it. Nina Gegechkori was 20 years old, and she understood exactly what kind of man she was agreeing to stand beside. She had watched the revolution. She had watched the new security apparatus assemble itself. She knew what the Cheka was. She knew what it did. She chose him anyway. Whether this represents love, calculation, or some fusion of the two that defies clean categorization, that question will follow her story all the way to its end. They married in 1921. She was 20. He was 22. The Soviet Union was barely 4 years old and everything was still being invented, including the rules for what a marriage inside its power structure was permitted to be. The early years moved fast, the way years do when a man is climbing and the footholds keep appearing beneath his feet. Beria rose through the Georgian security apparatus with a speed that alarmed some and impressed everyone. He was methodical. He delivered results. He developed a reputation for an absolute cold competence that the system rewarded above almost every other quality. In 1924, Nina gave birth to their only child, a son. They named him Sergo, after Grigory Ordzhonikidze, the powerful Georgian Bolshevik who had become one of Lavrenti's most important patrons. The name was not sentimental. The name was a message, a declaration of alignment, a small diplomatic act performed in a maternity ward. Even the naming of a child was in that world a political event. Nina understood this. She had understood it from the beginning. She built her life accordingly, maintaining her own interior world with ferocious care, her chemistry books, her languages, her music, while outwardly constructing the household that her husband's position required. She was the constant in a life of violent variables. She was the thing that did not move. What she could not have known, what no one could have known standing in the optimistic wreckage of a revolutionary decade, was the precise shape of what was coming. The purges, the terror, the particular darkness that would descend on the Soviet state in the 1930s and transform every institution, every relationship, every family, into something that bore only a superficial resemblance to what it had been before. She could not have known what the house on Malaya Nikitskaya would become, what it would contain, what it would cost. But she had made her choice. She had made it clearly, with open eyes, in a city where the revolutionary future was still legible as something resembling hope. The bill would come later. It always did. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of peace. It is a pressurized silence. The silence of rooms where every word is weighed before it is spoken, where the air itself seems to understand that certain things may be said and certain things absolutely may not. The mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya Street carried that silence in its walls, the way old wood carries the memory of rain. You felt it the moment you crossed the threshold. Guests felt it. Staff felt it. The family, Lavrenti, Nina, and young Sergo, had long since stopped feeling it, the way you stop hearing a clock that has been ticking in the same room for years. They had moved to Moscow in 1938. Beria had been summoned by Stalin to take command of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, the organ that by that point had become the central nervous system of Soviet state control. The appointment was a culmination and a transformation simultaneously. In Georgia, Beria had been powerful. In Moscow, he became something else entirely, something without a precise civilian equivalent, something the Russian language, which has a word for almost every gradation of authority and menace, could only approximate. The mansion had belonged, before the revolution, to a merchant family of some distinction. It was built in the style that Moscow called Northern Modernism: curved lines, decorative ironwork, high ceilings designed to impress rather than merely shelter. By the time the Beria family took residence, it had been comprehensively remade. The windows on the ground floor were reinforced with steel. The basement had been deepened and restructured into a shelter capable of withstanding what the engineers described, with bureaucratic understatement, as significant aerial events. The perimeter walls had been raised by nearly a meter. The gates were iron of a thickness that suggested the architect had been thinking less about aesthetics and more about the specific weight required to stop a determined vehicle. Inside, however, and this is the detail the visitors consistently noted with something between admiration and unease, inside it was beautiful. Nina had made it beautiful. This was not incidental. This was not the passive accumulation of objects that tends to happen when unlimited resources meet unlimited access. This was a deliberate act of will, the creation within a fortress of something that functioned as a genuine home. Genuine meaning a place where human beings could breathe. The rooms on the upper floors held furniture that had been selected with real taste. Pieces from the pre-revolutionary period that had survived the Great Dispersal. Paintings acquired through channels that it is perhaps better not to examine too closely, but that resulted in canvases of authentic quality hanging on walls that had been painted in colors Nina had chosen herself. Warm colors. The colors of a household that intended, against considerable odds, to remain a household. The centerpiece of her private domain was the winter garden on the second floor. She had filled it over the years with an accumulation of plants that represented something close to an obsession. Exotic specimens obtained through the botanical networks available to the wife of the NKVD chief. Ordinary houseplants tended with the same meticulous care. Seedlings she had started herself in small clay pots that lined the southern windowsill like a small civilization. When asked about it, and guests did ask, because the garden was remarkable, she offered a phrase that those who heard it never entirely forgot. "Plants do not lie," she said, "and they do not betray." The remark was received as whimsy. It was not whimsy. The household ran according to rhythms that Lavrenti established and Nina maintained. He was, in the domestic sphere as in every other, a man of system. He rose before 6 each morning, regardless of when he had gone to bed. He exercised, specifically and methodically, the way a man exercises, when he understands that physical deterioration is a form of vulnerability he cannot afford. He reviewed overnight communications before breakfast. He did not, as a rule, eat breakfast with his family. This was not hostility. This was simply the logic of his schedule, which operated on a frequency that the ordinary hours of domestic life could not reliably intersect. The evening was different. The evening meal was, with rare exceptions, a non-negotiable institution. Whatever the hour, whatever had transpired during the day, the family sat together at the long table in the formal dining room and ate together. This was Lavrenti's requirement, and Nina enforced it in his absence with the same authority that she enforced everything she had decided mattered. Sergo grew up understanding that the evening meal was not optional. It was not casual. It was a performance of family continuity that both of his parents had decided, for their separate reasons, was essential. The guests who came to that table represented a survey of Soviet power in its mid-century configuration. Marshals, ministers, scientists whose names were classified even as they sat eating Nina's food and drinking Georgian wine brought up from Tbilisi in cases that arrived by special allocation. Lavrenti Beria was not, by the accounts of those who encountered him socially, a natural host. He did not tell stories. He did not perform warmth. What he offered instead was attention, that same focused, absolute attention that had distinguished him since youth, directed across the dinner table at whoever happened to be seated opposite, making that person feel, for the duration, that they were the only person in the room. Nina was the host. Nina was always the host. She moved through those evenings with a fluency that appeared effortless and was in fact the product of enormous sustained intelligence, managing seating arrangements that encoded subtle political messages, steering conversations away from the particular shoals where they might founder, ensuring that the atmosphere remained precisely calibrated between the relaxed and the appropriately respectful. She spoke 5 languages by this point, and she deployed them at the table with tactical precision, sliding into French with certain guests, Georgian with others, switching to German when the occasion warranted. Men left those evenings having decided things. This was understood, in the way that many things in that world were understood, clearly, but without anyone saying it plainly. The dinner table on Malaya Nikitskaya was a place where the formal machinery of Soviet decision-making occasionally found its informal resolution, and Nina, who held no official position, who drew no salary, who appeared on no organizational chart, was at the center of it. Sergo grew up in the specific atmosphere that forms when a gifted child inhabits a household where love and surveillance are genuinely indistinguishable. His father was interested in him, genuinely, demonstrably interested, in the way that a man who has built an entire professional existence on the accurate assessment of human capability is interested in the human being he has produced. Lavrenti encouraged the boy's aptitude for mathematics and technical sciences, with a consistency that bordered on pressure. He taught him to shoot. He taught him to drive long before it was legally appropriate. He took him, on certain carefully chosen occasions, to facilities and institutions that gave Sergo an understanding of what his father's world actually contained, an education that no school curriculum offered and that no boy his age elsewhere in Moscow was receiving. He also interrogated him, not harshly, not with the instruments of his professional practice, but with the quiet, systematic thoroughness of a man for whom information gathering was as natural as breathing. Who were Sergo's friends? What did they say? What did their fathers do? What had been discussed? The questions arrived not as interrogation, but as conversation. And Sergo, who was intelligent and observant, understood the distinction and also understood that it was, in a meaningful sense, not a distinction at all. His father was always, on some level, working. Nina stood between them. This was her position in the family architecture, the mediating layer, the interpreter, the person who translated Lavrenti's demands into something Sergo could receive without being deformed by them, and translated Sergo's needs into something Lavrenti could register without dismissing them. It was exhausting work. It was invisible work. It was the kind of work that does not appear in any historical account, because it left no documents, generated no records, produced no artifacts that archivists could later retrieve and catalog. It was, nonetheless, the structural work that held the family together. The war years meant everything. In the early summer of 1941, when German forces crossed the Soviet border and the state entered its period of maximum danger and maximum internal violence simultaneously, Nina and Sergo were evacuated to Tbilisi. This was standard procedure for the families of senior officials, a precautionary dispersal that also served, though no one said this plainly, to provide leverage. A man whose family is safely distant is a man whose loyalty to the center can be more reliably assumed. Nina spent those years in Georgia doing what she had always, in the margins of her life, been doing: chemistry. She found work, found colleagues, found the particular satisfaction that comes from problems that can actually be solved. She was good at it. She had always been good at it. She had set it aside when Lavrenti's career demanded a full-time partner rather than an independent professional, and she had set it aside without visible complaint. But she had not forgotten it. The knowledge was still there. The capacity was still there. Georgia gave it back to her briefly, and she held it the way you hold something you have missed without quite admitting to yourself that you missed it. When she returned to Moscow after the war, the mansion was waiting. The garden had been maintained in her absence by the household staff, who understood that the plants were not incidental to Nina's well-being in the way that a perceptive employee understands the things that matter to their employer without being told explicitly. The plants had survived. The rooms were as she had left them. Lavrenti had also survived, which was not something that could be said of every Soviet official who had navigated the war years and their specific political undertow. He had emerged, in fact, considerably strengthened. His management of the internal security apparatus during the conflict, his oversight of the deportations of various peoples deemed strategically unreliable, his eventual role in the coordination of the atomic weapons program had made him, by the late 1940s, the second most powerful individual in the Soviet state, second to one man only. And that man was old and increasingly erratic, and the question of what would follow him was the question that every person who sat at the dinner table on Malaya Nikitskaya was thinking about, even as they discussed other things entirely. Nina tended her plants. She observed. She said very little about what she observed. The winter garden on the second floor had grown, over the years, into something remarkable, a contained wilderness, green and humid and alive in a house that the outside world associated exclusively with cold authority. Visitors who were shown it sometimes asked how she had time for such an undertaking, given everything. She would look at them with an expression that those visitors later struggled to describe accurately, something that was not quite amusement and not quite sadness and not quite either. Time, she would say, is the one thing they cannot requisition. The post-war years carried a particular texture of dread that those who lived through them described decades later in remarkably consistent terms. It was not the acute, thunderous dread of the purge years, the knock on the door at 3 a.m, the black car at the curb, the neighbor who was there on Tuesday and simply was not there on Wednesday. It was something slower and more ambient, a dread that had become environmental, a dread that you had learned to breathe around. The way you breathe around, the smell of something you cannot identify and cannot locate and therefore cannot do anything about. Inside the mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya, this dread took a specific form. Lavrenti came home later. He spoke less. The evenings at the long table became, if not shorter, then somehow thinner. The conversation more careful. The silences more frequent. The careful social machinery that Nina operated requiring more effort to produce the same results. She watched him. She had always watched him, with the particular attention of someone who has understood from the beginning that the man she married was capable of almost anything, and that her survival, and Sergei's survival, depended on her ability to read him accurately. What she read in those post-war years concerned her, not because he was becoming cruel. He had always been capable of cruelty. What concerned her was something different. He was becoming, she would later tell Sergei, afraid. And a man like Lavrenti Beria being afraid was, she understood, with the instinct of someone who had spent 30 years studying the subject, the most dangerous possible condition. Not for his enemies, for everyone around him. She tended her plants. She said very little. She waited. Outside the iron gates, Moscow went about its business. The atomic program produced its results. The Cold War settled into its long configuration. Children were born and people died, and the machinery of the Soviet state continued its enormous grinding operation, indifferent to the human material it consumed. Inside the winter garden, in the particular green quiet she had constructed for herself within the fortress, Nina Gegechkori Beria kept alive the things that required tending. She had always known this was the work. She had known it on the day she married him. The bill, when it finally arrived, would be larger than even she had calculated. But it had not arrived yet. It is a detail that sounds small until you understand the context, and then it sounds like exactly what it was. A man who had spent 3 decades reading the signs of approaching catastrophe, reading them in the faces of subordinates and the silences of superiors and the particular quality of attention that preceded destruction, now reading them in his own situation and responding in the only way his nature permitted, systematically and too late. The winter of 1952 and the early months of 1953 were the final season of the Stalin era, though no one in that house, or in any house in Moscow, could say so plainly. The General Secretary was 73 years old and deteriorating in ways that those closest to him could observe, but could not acknowledge and could not discuss. The paranoia that had always been a feature of his governance had become, in these final months, something more total, a consuming suspicion that operated independently of evidence, that found treachery and proximity and loyalty in no one. The so-called doctor's plot, the fabricated accusation that a group of predominantly Jewish physicians had been engaged in a conspiracy to assassinate Soviet leadership, was the public face of something that those inside the system understood as a signal of a coming purge. The question was not whether another wave of terror was being prepared. The question was its precise shape and who would be inside it, and whether anything could be done to alter the answer to that second question. Beria burned documents through January and February of 1953. The fireplaces in the mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya were in use at hours that made no sense given the season, and producing a heat that made no sense given the size of the fires that ordinary domestic use required. Nina watched the smoke rise from the chimneys on mornings when she walked in the garden, and she did not ask what was burning. She had lived long enough inside this world to understand that not asking was sometimes the most protective thing available to her. She asked him one thing. She asked it in the Georgian that was always the language of their most serious conversations, the language that felt, to both of them, most fully their own. "Are you frightened?" He looked at her across the breakfast table with those heavy-framed spectacles and that expression she had spent 30 years learning to read, and he said nothing for a long moment, and then he said, "No." She did not believe him. He knew she did not believe him. This was perhaps the most honest exchange they had in that final winter. Stalin died on the 5th of March, 1953. The official announcement reached the public on the 6th. In the mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya, they knew on the 5th, knew within hours, the way people at the innermost ring of power always know things, before those things become available to ordinary knowledge. Nina sat with the information for a long time before she said anything. What she felt, and this is documented in fragments, in things she said to Sergo years later, in the single letter that has survived from that period, was not simple. It was not the clean liberation that retrospective accounts sometimes attribute to those who suffered under Stalin and outlived him. It was something more complicated and more honest. Relief, yes, genuine and immediate relief that the source of the specific threat that had been gathering through the winter was gone. But beneath the relief, something colder. An awareness that the removal of one danger does not mean the removal of all danger. The power vacuums are not peaceful spaces. That the men who would now compete to inherit the succession were men she knew, had sat at dinner with, had watched, had assessed over years, and that not one of them was someone whose goodwill could be considered reliable. She told Sergo, "Now it becomes more dangerous, not less." He thought she was being excessive. He was 30 years old, and his father was arguably the most powerful man left standing in the Soviet state, and the dictator who had kept every subordinate in a state of perpetual existential precariousness was gone. He allowed himself, in those early March weeks, something that he would later describe with a kind of rueful self-assessment as optimism. Nina tended her plants. She watched her husband. Beria moved fast in the weeks after Stalin's death, with a speed and decisiveness that alarmed his colleagues in the collective leadership that had nominally assembled to manage the succession. He moved to release hundreds of thousands of prisoners from the labor camp system. He pushed for a relaxation of the nationalities policies that had been among the most brutal instruments of Stalinist control. He proposed, through channels that his colleagues found disconcertingly direct, a possible reunification of Germany as a neutral state, a foreign policy initiative of such radical departure from established doctrine that it read, to those receiving it, less like a policy proposal and more like a signal that Lavrenti Beria had decided the rules of the game had changed and that he intended to write the new ones himself. Nina watched all of this and said, in the Georgian of their private conversations, "You are making enemies faster than you are making allies." He dismissed this. He had always operated at speeds that others found uncomfortable. Speed was a feature of his method, not a flaw. He had risen by moving faster than the people around him, by deciding before they decided, by positioning himself ahead of the logic of events rather than behind it. This was not different. "It is completely different," Nina said. "Before, there was one man to read. Now there are 10, and 9 of them are frightened of you." He left for the Kremlin on the morning of the 26th of June, 1953, as he left every morning in the black car through the iron gates with the security detail that had accompanied him for 15 years. He had kissed her that morning. This was noted later by the household staff as unusual, not because he was an unaffectionate man in private, but because the morning departure was, by long-established routine, not an occasion for displays of feeling. He kissed her, and he looked at her for a moment in the doorway, and then he walked to the car. He did not come back. What happened inside the Kremlin that afternoon, the precise sequence, the moment when the formal meeting became something else, when his colleagues revealed themselves as a coordinated opposition rather than a collection of individuals when the military men entered the room, has been reconstructed from multiple sources over the decades since, and the reconstructions do not entirely agree on sequence, but agree on outcome. Lavrentiy Beria was arrested by a group that included senior military figures acting in coordination with Nikita Khrushchev and other members of the collective leadership. He was removed from the Kremlin. He was taken to a secure facility. He was, from that moment forward, a prisoner. The knock on the door at Malaya Nikitskaya came while Nina was in the winter garden. She came downstairs to find uniformed men, not the regular security detail, not any face she recognized, standing in her entrance hall with the specific posture of people who have been told they are in charge and are making sure everyone in the room understands this. She looked at them. She asked her question. "Is he alive?" No one answered her. This was, she would later tell Sergo, its own kind of answer, because men delivering news of a death in those circumstances do not pause. They announce. The pause meant something. She held on to the pause. The search lasted for days. They moved through the mansion room by room, floor by floor, with an inventory-taking thoroughness that transformed every space, the dining room, the winter garden, the bedroom, the library, into a site of official examination. They took papers. They took boxes of documents. They took objects whose significance they could not always have explained, but whose confiscation was part of the logic of erasure, the removal of the physical traces of a life that the state had decided should be understood differently. Nina did not cry during the search. The household staff, in the accounts they gave decades later, were consistent on this point. She moved through those days with a composure that some of them described as inhuman and others described as the only human response available to a woman of her particular formation, a response that had been prepared, not in those days, but over 30 years of living inside a system that she had always understood could do exactly this. She ate. She slept, or at least she went to the bedroom and closed the door at the hours when sleeping was what a person was supposed to do. She asked, with reasonable and persistent frequency, for information about her husband's condition and whereabouts, and she received, with the consistent bureaucratic courtesy of people who have been instructed to give nothing, no information. She tended the few plants that remained in the garden that the searchers had not disturbed. The trial was not a trial in any sense that the word carries in systems where it describes something other than the formal ratification of a predetermined conclusion. Beria was charged with treason, terrorism, and a range of crimes against the state that had been assembled with the practiced efficiency of a system that had been constructing such charges for 3 decades and had refined the method to the point of bureaucratic elegance. The proceedings were conducted in closed session. The verdict was known before the proceedings began. On the 23rd of December, 1953, 180 days after his arrest, the sentence was announced. Nina heard it on the radio. This is the detail that requires sitting with for a moment. The wife of the man who had for 15 years been among the most powerful figures in the Soviet state. The woman who had built and maintained the household on Malaya Nikitskaya, who had hosted marshals and ministers and scientists at her table, who had spoken 5 languages in the service of her husband's position. She learned of his execution from a radio broadcast like anyone else. Like any ordinary citizen in any ordinary apartment anywhere in the Soviet Union who happened to have the radio on that December evening. There was no special notification. There was no official communication. There was just the voice from the speaker, and the sentence, and then the ordinary programming that continued afterward, because the machinery of Soviet broadcasting did not pause for the widows of executed men. Sergo was with her. He watched her hear it. She sat for a long time without moving. Then she stood. She went to her room and closed the door. Sergo stood in the hallway for, by his own account, given in the memoir he published decades later, what felt like a very long time. He did not knock. He understood, with the instinct of a son who had spent 30 years learning to read this woman, that she needed to be alone with it for whatever duration she required. Several hours later, the door opened. Nina looked at her son. Her face was composed. Her voice, when she spoke, was steady, not the steadiness of someone suppressing something, but the steadiness of someone who has, in the hours behind the closed door, passed through something and come out on the other side of it. "Sergo," she said, "now we must live forward." What followed was an education in how a state consumes its own. The mansion was confiscated. The furniture, the antiques, the paintings, the objects Nina had spent years selecting, was removed by official inventory. The household staff was dispersed. The black cars, the security detail, the allocation of goods and access and proximity that constituted the material existence of a senior Soviet official's family, all of it ceased, with an abruptness that the administrative language of confiscation notices rendered as merely procedural. They were sent to Sverdlovsk, the industrial city in the Urals that served, in the Soviet geography of exile, as a destination that was not a prison, but was also unmistakably not a choice. Sergo lost his position. He was interrogated repeatedly, sessions conducted by men who wanted either information or confession, or ideally both, and who approached the task with the professional patience of people trained in a school that Beria himself had helped to build. Nina refused to cooperate. This is the word the official record uses, refused. She appeared at the required sessions. She sat across from her interrogators. And she declined, consistently and without hostility, to provide what they were seeking. She said one thing that the interrogators recorded because they could not quite fit it into the category of cooperation or resistance, and felt apparently that it required documentation. He was hard. He was sometimes cruel. But he was not a traitor to this state. He built this state. You are using its methods on his family, and you do not see the irony, because the system does not permit irony. No one answered her. She went home. She tended what plants she had been able to bring. She waited for whatever came next. It was, she would say later, not courage. Courage implies a choice between fear and action. She had passed beyond the architecture of that choice. There was only what remained to be done, and she intended to do it. Outside, in the December dark of a Ural city, the Soviet Union continued its enormous, indifferent operation. She was 51 years old. She had approximately 38 years left to live. Not one of them would be easy. Not one of them would be wasted. Not heroism. Heroism requires an audience, a narrative arc, a moment where the choice is visible and the stakes are legible to everyone watching. Not mere endurance. Endurance is passive, a quality of objects as much as people. A stone endures, a wall endures. What Nina Gegich-Kori Beria practiced in the decades after December 1953 was something more precise and more demanding than either of those categories. It was the active, daily, deliberate construction of a life in the ruins of another life. The refusal, sustained across nearly 4 decades, to allow the verdict of the state to become the verdict of the self. She arrived in Sverdlovsk in the winter of 1954 as a woman stripped of virtually everything that the external world uses to locate a person: address, possessions, social position, the accumulated material evidence of a life. What she retained was not nothing. It was, in fact, the core of everything: her education, her languages, her chemistry, and the photographs. She had managed to bring photographs. The interrogators had taken papers, documents, anything that might constitute evidence of political significance. They had not taken the small collection of personal photographs that Nina had folded into a book, a chemistry textbook specifically, perhaps because the instinct for concealment that 30 years inside the Soviet power structure develops in a person operates even in extremis. The photographs showed Lavrenti at various ages, in various configurations of official and domestic life. There was one. Sergo described it in his memoir with a precision that suggests it was the one he saw most often. Of the 3 of them in the garden of a Georgian dacha, taken sometime in the late 1930s. Lavrenti is squinting slightly against the sun. Nina is looking not at the camera, but at something slightly to the left of it. Sergo, perhaps 15 years old, is standing between them with the particular expression of an adolescent who has not yet decided how much of himself to reveal. Nina kept this photograph on whatever surface served as her primary workspace for the rest of her life. The Sverdlovsk years were built around the laboratory. She found work, the precise mechanics of how a woman whose name was Beria found work in a Soviet industrial city in the mid-1950s. When that name was being systematically erased from every official record, involve a combination of factors that defy clean reconstruction. Perhaps the institution did not know. Perhaps the relevant administrator knew and chose not to act on the knowledge. Perhaps the specific quality of Nina's competence was sufficiently apparent in a brief interaction that the practical calculus came down in her favor. Whatever the mechanism, she worked. She worked in a chemical research capacity that was several grades below what her training and ability warranted, and she worked without complaint about this discrepancy, because the discrepancy was not the point. The point was the work itself, the problems that had answers, the experiments that produced results, the particular discipline of scientific inquiry that required your full attention and gave it back to you as something clean and verifiable and entirely indifferent to your biography. Her colleagues in those early years knew her as Nina Gegich-Kori, her maiden name, which she had returned to with the pragmatic recognition that the alternative was not viable. They did not know, or did not know with certainty, who she was. What they knew was what the work revealed: a woman of exceptional intelligence and rigorous method, somewhat reserved in the social rituals of institutional life, possessed of a dry precision in conversation that some found intimidating and others found bracingly honest. There are accounts from colleagues from those decades, gathered by researchers who combed through Sverdlovsk in the Glasnost era, looking for traces of the story, that are consistent in one particular. Everyone who worked with Nina Gegich-Kori in that period describes the same quality. Not the sadness they might have expected, not the diminishment. Something more difficult to name, a kind of concentrated presence, as if the reduction of the external world had increased the density of what remained. One colleague, interviewed decades later, put it this way: "She was the most fully alive person I have ever worked with." You felt, talking to her, that nothing was being wasted. Sergo rebuilt differently, at a different pace, through different channels. He had his father's capacity for systematic effort and his mother's intellectual rigor, and he applied both to the project of reconstructing a professional existence from the material available to a man whose surname was a political liability of the first order. He changed nothing about himself, including the name, which he retained with a stubbornness that those who knew him understood was not mere stubbornness, but a position, a quiet, sustained refusal to perform the erasure that the state desired. He worked in technical fields, specifically in defense-related engineering, which had the paradoxical quality of being both the domain most associated with his father's career and the domain in which his own abilities were most obviously genuine. He advanced slowly, and then more steadily as the political weather shifted incrementally through the Khrushchev years and into the Brezhnev era. He earned his doctorate in technical sciences. He built a reputation on the basis of his work, which was sufficient over time to create a professional standing that existed somewhat independently of his name. He and Nina remained close throughout these decades in the way that people remain close who have been through a shared experience that no one else can fully understand, not constantly in each other's physical presence, but connected by the specific gravity of a common history. They spoke regularly. They argued occasionally in the way of people who love each other and also know each other well enough to disagree without performance. Sergo thought Nina was too closed. Nina thought Sergo was, at various points in his life, too open, too trusting, too willing to believe that the political environment had changed more fundamentally than it actually had. They were both right in their respective ways at their respective moments. The question of Beria's legacy did not wait for Sergo to address it. History was already in the process of constructing an account, and the account being constructed served the needs of the state that had executed him, a state that required his crimes to be total and his person to be irredeemable, because anything less than totality would raise questions about the system that had produced him and celebrated him and relied upon him for 15 years. The official Soviet account made Beria a monster without context. This is not the same as making him innocent. He was not innocent. The crimes attributed to him, the terror, the deportations, the specific cruelties of the NK-5D years, were real. They had happened. People had suffered them. People had died of them. The weight of what he had done and supervised and ordered was not a fabrication of his enemies. But monsters without context are useful to systems that need to explain their own violence as the product of aberrant individuals rather than structural logic. The Soviet state in the Khrushchev era needed Beria to be uniquely evil in a way that absolved the system of its share of the accounting. It needed him to have been an exception rather than an expression. Nina did not accept this framing. This was not because she was blind to what her husband had been and done. It was because she was a chemist, and a chemist understands that the properties of a compound cannot be attributed entirely to one element within it. She had watched the system operate for 30 years from a position of proximity that virtually no historian or analyst would ever achieve. She understood its logic from the inside. He was made by it as much as he made it, she told Sergo once, in a conversation he recorded in his memoir. This does not excuse him, but it explains things that the official version cannot explain, because the official version requires him to have been something other than human. The Glasnost era changed everything and changed nothing simultaneously. When Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms created, in the mid-1980s, the first genuine public space for historical re-examination that the Soviet Union had permitted in decades, Sergo understood immediately what it meant. He had been waiting for something like this, not with the passive waiting of someone hoping for rescue, but with the active, prepared waiting of someone who has spent years assembling material precisely for the moment when a space opens in which it can be used. He began writing. The memoir that would be published in the final years of the Soviet Union, titled My Father Lavrenti Beria, was a document that defied simple categorization. It was not a defense. Sergo was too intelligent, too honest, and too aware of the historical record to attempt a defense. It was something more nuanced and more difficult, an account of a man as seen by a son, with full acknowledgement of the man's crimes and full insistence on the man's humanity. Those two things held in deliberate, uncomfortable tension throughout. The book caused controversy, as books that refuse to confirm existing narratives always cause controversy. Those who needed Beria to be purely a monster found the portrait of a father who taught his son mathematics and drove him to the technical institutes and sat at the dinner table every evening to be an affront, as if the existence of ordinary human behavior in a man who committed extraordinary crimes somehow diminished the crimes. Those who wanted the book to be a rehabilitation found Sergo's unflinching acknowledgement of his father's role in the terror to be a betrayal of the memoir's implicit purpose. Sergo did not much care about either reaction. He had written what he knew. He had written it as accurately as he could, with the sources available to him and the memory he had maintained over 4 decades of a life shaped entirely by the subject of the book. He offered no conclusion. He offered testimony. He applied for his father's formal legal rehabilitation until the end of his life. He did not receive it. He died in 2001 in Moscow, without having achieved the official peresmoter, the reconsideration, that he had pursued with the same methodical persistence that characterized everything he did. He was buried without the thing he had wanted most. He was not, by any account of those who knew him, broken by this. He had understood, perhaps from the beginning, that the wanting was the point, that the continued application for justice was its own form of testimony, regardless of outcome. Nina did not live to see the glasnost era's full flowering. She died in 1991, in the final year of the Soviet Union. She had entered as a young bride 7 decades earlier, the same year the state that had executed her husband and confiscated her home and sent her into exile finally dissolved into its constituent parts, as if it had been waiting for her to finish with it before allowing itself to end. She was 89 years old. She had been living in Moscow for some years by then, returned from the Sverdlovsk decades, occupying a small apartment that was a different universe from the mansion on Malaya Nikitskaya in every material sense, and in no sense at all in terms of what the space contained, which was a woman of extraordinary interior density. Her books, her plants, and the photographs she had carried inside a chemistry textbook through the worst years, and never after that allowed out of her possession. She had not been rehabilitated. She had not received an official apology. She had not been restored to any of the things the state had taken. She had spent the final decades of her life as Nina Gegichkori, chemist, former resident of Sverdlovsk, a small, precise woman with careful hands and 5 languages, and the habit, noted by everyone who knew her in old age, of going absolutely still when she was thinking, a stillness so complete that it registered as something more than the mere absence of movement. She died with the photographs on the surface beside her. The rehabilitation never came. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren dispersed into the lives that subsequent generations construct when the weight of a family history requires active management. Some changed their surnames, a practical decision, a survival decision, the kind of decision that requires no moral judgment from those who did not face the same calculation. Some did not. Some pursued careers in fields entirely removed from anything that might intersect with the name. Some found, in various ways and at various points in their lives, that the intersection was unavoidable, that the name found you regardless of your efforts, that it arrived in conversations and background checks and the particular look on someone's face when they made the connection. One granddaughter, speaking to a researcher in the early years of the current century and requesting anonymity, a request that tells its own story about the continued weight of the name, said something that has been quoted in several subsequent accounts because it contains, in a small space, the entire impossible question that every subsequent generation inherits from a history like this one. "I am not responsible for what he did," she said. "I know that, but I am responsible for what I understand about it, and I am responsible for not pretending that he was either a saint or a cartoon villain, because both of those are lies, and the lies serve people who have their own reasons for wanting the truth to be simpler than it is." She paused. "I can only try to understand," she said. "That is all any of us can do." The house on Malaya Nikitskaya Street is an embassy now. The nation it represents changes in the accounts of different sources, depending on when the account was written. The building has housed several diplomatic missions over the decades since the Soviet state reclaimed it and redistributed it according to its own logic. The iron gates are still there. The stone walls are still there. The three-story modernist facade that Nina looked at for 15 years from every angle that a house can be seen from looks back at Malaya Nikitskaya Street with the sealed, impassive expression of a building that has decided to keep its own counsel. People still come to stand at the gates. Not many people, and not with any regularity that would constitute a pattern, but enough that the phenomenon is documented. Individuals, sometimes couples, occasionally small groups, who come to look at the building and stand in front of it for a while and then leave. What they are looking for, or looking at, or attempting to complete by the act of standing there is not always clear. Perhaps it is the specific satisfaction that certain people find in making pilgrimage to the sites where history became concrete, where the abstract forces of ideology and power and terror took the form of specific human beings living in specific rooms, making specific choices, suffering specific consequences. Perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps they come because the story is not finished, not in the sense that the events are unresolved, because the events have their resolutions, however unsatisfying, but in the sense that the questions the story raises have not been answered, not by history, not by the courts, not by the competing narratives that have been assembled and reassembled over 7 decades. Sergo said it in the final interview he gave before his death, answering a question about what he ultimately wanted for his father's memory. He was an old man by then, in his late 70s, speaking with the measured deliberateness of someone who has spent a lifetime choosing words carefully and has not stopped. "I do not ask for him to be forgiven," he said. "I do not ask for the crimes to be minimized or the victims to be forgotten. I ask only for one thing. I ask for it to be acknowledged that he was a human being of his epoch, formed by it, serving it, destroyed by it. Not a demon, not a hero, a man. If history cannot hold that complexity, then history is failing in its primary obligation, which is truth." He looked at the interviewer. "The truth is always more difficult than the verdict," he said. "That is precisely why we need it." Nina Beria never gave a final interview. She did not write a memoir. She did not leave, as far as the available record shows, any document in which she attempted a retrospective account of her own life, its choices, its costs, its meaning. She left the photographs, she left the plants, in the care of whoever agreed to take them after she was gone. She left the chemistry work, published under her maiden name in the journals of her field, work that was respectable and competent and entirely disconnected, in its professional context, from everything else that her life had contained. She left one letter, written sometime in the 1970s, addressed to Sergo, preserved in the family archive and quoted in his memoir in a passage that he described as the most difficult to write in the entire book. The letter is short. It does not attempt comprehensive summation. It does not resolve the questions that her life had spent decades holding open. It says, among other things, that she had not regretted the choice, not the choice of the man, that specific choice, made in Tiflis in the early 1920s by a 20-year-old woman who understood exactly what she was choosing and chose it anyway. She had not regretted it. This was not the same as saying it had been easy or right in every sense, or free of cost. She was a chemist. She understood that reactions have products and that some products are not what you intended when you initiated the reaction. But the choice itself, the yes at the beginning, she had not regretted. That the plants were important, that this required no explanation, that she hoped he would find, in whatever remained of his life, the particular peace that comes not from the resolution of difficult questions, but from the willingness to continue holding them without demanding that they resolve on your schedule, that she loved him. Outside the embassy on Malaya Nikitskaya Street, on an ordinary afternoon, a woman stands at the iron gates. She is not old, not young. She has come alone. She stands for a while looking at the building, at the windows, at the stone, at the ironwork that has survived everything the 20th century put it through. She does not take photographs. She does not consult anything she has written down. After a time, she turns and walks back toward the street, toward the ordinary city, toward the life that exists at a distance from this gate and this wall and this building full of sealed rooms and unreturned things. She does not look back. There is nothing left to see that she has not already seen. The questions go with her, the way they go with everyone who comes here, unanswered, necessary, alive.